I'm a 26-year-old woman, and I've been financially independent since I was 19. That independence didn't come easy. My family made sure of that. Growing up, my parents were the kind of people who believed that a good daughter did as she was told, no questions asked. My life was a constant tug of war between their need for control and my desire for freedom. My parents loved rules. Everything had to go through them, who I could be friends with, what I could wear, and even what extracurriculars I joined. They weren't abusive, just very controlling. To them, independence was a threat. If you didn't rely on them for everything, it meant you didn't respect them. That's the environment I grew up in, and it made me determined to carve out a life for myself on my terms. When I graduated high school, they were thrilled that I got into a local college. They insisted I stay at home to save money and focus on my studies. I went along with it for a year, but then I decided to move out. I got a part-time job at a coffee shop and found a roommate. My parents were furious. They saw my decision as a slap in the face. They called it wasting money and making irresponsible choices. I saw it as freedom. Living on my own was tough. I juggled school, 2 part-time jobs, and endless late-night study sessions, but it was worth it. By the time I graduated with a degree in computer science, I had lined up a full-time job in tech. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough for me to finally stop working multiple jobs. My parents weren't impressed. They wanted me to ask for their advice on everything: where to work, what to spend money on, and even what to do with my weekends. I didn't. Oh, the first major blow-up came when I bought a car without telling them. It was a used sedan, nothing fancy, but to my parents, it was like I'd committed a crime. They said I should have asked them first, even though I was paying for it entirely with my own money. The argument ended with them calling me ungrateful and too independent for my own good. Fast forward a couple of years, and I managed to save enough to buy a house. It wasn't a mansion, just a small 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, but it was mine. I didn't tell my parents until after the deal closed. I thought they'd be happy for me, but I was wrong. They called me up, demanding to know why I hadn't consulted them. My mom accused me of disrespecting their guidance, and my dad said I was acting like I didn't need a family. That's when they decided to cut me off. By cut me off, I mean they stopped speaking to me entirely. They canceled the family phone plan I'd been on and removed me from their health insurance. They stopped inviting me to family gatherings and, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, started telling everyone I was selfish and thought I was better than them. At first, it hurt. I won't lie, being iced out by your own family stings, even when you know you did nothing wrong. But I leaned into my independence. I threw myself into work, got a promotion, and treated myself to a new car. I started decorating my house, learning to garden, and hosting game nights with friends. My life was good, but my family saw it differently. They followed me on social media and apparently couldn't handle seeing me happy. My mom told an aunt that my posts were flaunting my success and rubbing it in their faces. My younger sibling, who still lived at home, started echoing my parents' complaints, calling me out in group chats for being too proud to admit I needed family. I didn't engage. I wasn't going to argue or beg them to let me back into their lives. If they wanted to talk, they knew where to find me, but they weren't interested in talking. They wanted me to apologize, to admit I'd been wrong, to strike out on my own, and to promise to listen to their advice moving forward. That wasn't going to happen. Then, the power dynamic shifted. A few months after the fallout, I heard through a friend that my dad had lost his job, and my mom's small business was struggling. My sibling had dropped out of college and moved back home. Suddenly, the family that had cut me off for being too independent was facing serious financial trouble. They didn't reach out to me directly, but I started noticing little things, likes on my Instagram posts, comments on old photos. They were testing the waters. I knew I had a choice to make. I could keep my distance and let them deal with the consequences of their decisions, or I could step in and help, but on my terms this time. No more guilt trips, no more guilt trips, no more power plays. If they wanted my help, they'd have to meet me halfway. That's where things started to get interesting. Update 1. Months after the fallout, I started hearing whispers about my family's struggles. It wasn't hard to piece together what was happening. My dad had been laid off from his job, and my mom's small business was downsizing rapidly. They'd always lived on the edge financially, and it seemed like things had finally tipped over. On top of that, my younger sibling had dropped out of college and moved back home. It sounded like things were going downhill fast. At first, none of this information came directly from them. A friend mentioned seeing my dad's old company post about layoffs on social media. Then, a mutual acquaintance casually brought up that my mom had put her business equipment up for sale. None of it surprised me. My parents were never great with money. They always believed things would somehow work themselves out and didn't believe in budgeting or saving for emergencies. What did catch me off guard was the subtle shift in their behavior toward me. They still hadn't reached out directly, but they'd started liking my Instagram posts, ones they'd ignored for months. My mom even left a heart emoji on a picture of a plant I'd posted. It wasn't much, but for someone who'd been ghosted by her own family, it felt like a deliberate move. Around the same time, a neighbor who knew my parents mentioned they were having trouble keeping up with their bills. Their power had almost been shut off, and they'd been borrowing groceries from a church pantry. The news didn't make me feel triumphant, but it did make me stop and think. I knew how stubborn my parents could be. They'd never admit they needed help, especially not from me. Still, I couldn't ignore what I was hearing. I decided to help, but on my terms. There was no way I was walking back into that toxic dynamic without boundaries. I started small, anonymously sending them grocery store gift cards. I made sure there was no way for them to trace the cards back to me. A week later, I heard from the same neighbor that my mom had been talking about how a kind church group was helping them out. I couldn't help but laugh. They had no idea it was me. Encouraged by that small success, I took it a step further. I called the utility company and paid off their overdue bill to keep their power from being shut off. I wasn't doing this to get credit. I just couldn't stand the thought of them sitting in a cold, dark house. A few days later, I saw my mom post on Facebook, thanking God for miraculously providing during their tough time. The irony wasn't lost on me. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. I sent a couple more gift cards and even paid off a small medical bill I found out they owed. Every time, they assumed the help was coming from somewhere else. Part of me was okay with staying in the background, but another part of me started feeling conflicted. They were benefiting from my help while still blaming me for all their problems. At some point, I knew I'd have to address the elephant in the room. Things came to a head when my younger sibling called me out of the blue. It wasn't an emotional reconciliation or anything. They kept the conversation light, talking about their job hunt and how tough things had been at home. I could tell they were testing the waters, seeing how much I'd be willing to share. They didn't apologize or acknowledge the way they'd sided with our parents during the fallout, but it was the first real contact I'd had with any of them in months. After that call, I started planning my next move. The anonymous help had worked well so far, but it wasn't sustainable. If I was going to step in more directly, I needed to set some ground rules. I decided that if my family wanted my help moving forward, they'd have to meet me halfway. That meant acknowledging my independence and, at the very least, apologizing for how they'd treated me. I wasn't asking for a groveling apology, just something that showed they understood I wasn't the villain in this story. I knew this wouldn't be easy. My parents were proud people who didn't like admitting when they were wrong. But if they truly wanted my support, they'd have to accept that I wasn't a kid who needed their guidance anymore. I was done letting them hold my independence against me. The next step was figuring out how to approach them without giving up the boundaries I'd worked so hard to build. I wasn't going to let them guilt me into anything, but I also didn't want to shut the door completely. My goal was to offer help on my terms and see if they were willing to rise to the occasion. It was a gamble, but I was ready to play the game. Update 2. After weeks of staying in the background, I decided it was time to initiate direct contact. The anonymous help had run its course, and while my parents had benefited from it, they didn't seem any closer to acknowledging the role I'd played in their newfound stability. It was clear they needed more than just financial assistance, they needed a reality check. So I sent my mom a casual text. It wasn't anything dramatic. I kept it light, asking how things were going and mentioning that I'd heard from a friend that they'd been having a tough time. My mom responded quickly, which was surprising given how long they'd gone without reaching out. She kept the tone warm, like nothing had ever happened between us. She told me about their struggles but avoided any mention of our fallout. It was as if she wanted to pretend everything was fine. I let her talk and subtly brought up their financial troubles. I didn't push too hard, just enough to let her know I was aware of what was going on. She didn't deny it, but she didn't elaborate much either. Instead, she focused on how they were managing and how God had been providing. I could almost hear the pride in her words, even through the screen. That's when I decided to lay my cards on the table. I told her I was willing to help them out, but it would come with conditions. If they wanted my financial support, they'd have to acknowledge the way they'd treated me and apologize. I wasn't asking for groveling or anything over the top, just a simple, sincere apology and an acknowledgement that I wasn't a villain for wanting independence. I made it clear that without these conditions, there would be no help. At first, there was silence. Then, after what felt like forever, my mom responded. She thanked me for offering to help but said she needed to talk it over with my dad. I knew exactly what that meant. My dad's pride was always a roadblock, and I didn't expect him to take kindly to my terms. The next day, my younger sibling called me. This time, they weren't testing the waters, they were apologizing. They admitted they'd taken sides during the fallout, because it was easier than going against our parents. They said they regretted how things had played out and thanked me for the anonymous help, which they'd figured out was from me. It was the first real moment of honesty I'd had with anyone in my family since the fallout, and it gave me a glimmer of hope. But my parents were a different story. My mom called me later that evening, sounding hesitant. She told me they appreciated my offer but didn't think it was fair to attach conditions to my help. She used phrases like family shouldn't keep score and love should be unconditional. It was clear they saw my terms as manipulative, which honestly wasn't surprising. I stood firm. I repeated my conditions, calmly but clearly, and told her that if they weren't willing to meet me halfway, I couldn't help them. That's when the bickering started. Apparently, my parents couldn't agree on whether to accept my terms. My mom was leaning toward swallowing her pride, but my dad was adamant that they shouldn't bow down to their daughter. Meanwhile, my siblings started reaching out more frequently. They were the first to truly rebuild a relationship with me, texting me updates about their job hunt, and even asking for advice. They admitted they felt trapped at home and wanted to move out eventually but didn't know how to break the cycle of dependency. I offered to help them with a plan, one that included part-time work and eventually going back to school. They were hesitant, but seemed genuinely interested. A few days later, my parents made their first attempt at an apology. It came in the form of a long, rambling text from my mom. She acknowledged some of their actions but framed them as misunderstandings. She said things like, "We never meant to hurt you and you misunderstood our intentions." It wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but it was a start. I responded by thanking her for the message, but made it clear that I was looking for sincerity, not excuses. I told her I needed them to take responsibility for their actions, not just sweep them under the rug. My dad, predictably, was furious. He called me manipulative and accused me of trying to control them with money. My mom seemed caught in the middle, torn between her pride and the reality of their situation. As the days went on, I started hearing from mutual acquaintances that my parents were asking others to mediate. They wanted someone to convince me to drop my conditions and just help out like family should. It was exhausting, but I refused to budge. I'd spent years letting them control me, and I wasn't about to give them that power back. Eventually, the cracks started to show. My mom began hinting in her texts that they were reconsidering my terms. My dad was still holding out, but it was clear he was feeling the pressure. Their financial situation wasn't improving, and they knew they couldn't keep going without help. It was only a matter of time before something gave. Update 3. Weeks of tension finally came to a head with a phone call I wasn't entirely expecting. After days of back-and-forth texts with my mom, she called me and, for the first time, offered an apology. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The tone was begrudging. and I could tell it wasn't something my dad had agreed to easily. Still, it was a step forward, and I decided to proceed cautiously. I made it clear from the start that the apology was a condition for moving forward, not the end of the conversation. I reminded them that any help I offered would be temporary, structured, and strictly conditional on mutual respect. There would be no blank checks, no handouts, and no enabling old habits. They agreed, though it was obvious my dad wasn't thrilled about it. I started small. I arranged to cover their overdue utility bills, but instead of giving them the money directly, I paid the vendors myself. I also sent another grocery gift card, this time openly, not anonymously. My mom sent me a heartfelt thank you message, mentioning how much it helped. She even started texting me updates about how they were using the money, which was a surprising turn from her previous silence. My dad, on the other hand, wasn't as cooperative. While he accepted the help, he couldn't resist making passive-aggressive comments about being bailed out by his own daughter. My mom tried to smooth things over, but it was clear he was struggling with his pride. I let his comments slide for the most part, but I made sure to reiterate that disrespect would result in me walking away again. He didn't push too far after that. In the middle of all this, my younger siblings started reaching out more often. They'd already apologized and were now becoming an unexpected ally. They confided in me about how trapped they felt living at home, especially with the increased tension from my parents' financial struggles. They admitted they wanted to go back to school but didn't know how to make it work financially. I saw this as an opportunity to help them take control of their life. I offered to cover their first semester's tuition if they agreed to work part-time to contribute. It wasn't a handout, it was a partnership. They were hesitant at first, unsure if they could handle the pressure of school and work, but after a few conversations, they started warming up to the idea. My parents, predictably, pushed back. They insisted my sibling was too fragile to balance both school and work, and that adding any extra stress would only make things worse. I stood firm, explaining that independence was non-negotiable, and that this was about setting them up for long-term success. Eventually, my sibling made the decision to move forward with the plan, encouraged by my support. With the tuition payment squared away and a part-time job lined up, my sibling began taking small but meaningful steps toward independence. Watching them grow was one of the most rewarding parts of this entire ordeal. They started opening up more about the toxic dynamics at home and how our parents' controlling nature had held them back for so long. It was like watching a weight lift off their shoulders as they began to see a way out. Meanwhile, the dynamics with my parents continued to shift. My mom, who had been the first to reach out and apologize, started showing genuine gratitude for the help. She was more communicative and even asked for advice on budgeting and cutting costs. She sold off some unnecessary household items and started keeping track of expenses for the first time. It wasn't a huge change, but it was progress. My dad, however, remained distant. He was polite enough to avoid outright conflict, but the resentment was still there. He avoided engaging directly with me and often left the room when my mom or sibling brought up my name. It was clear he was struggling with the new dynamic, where he was no longer the unquestioned head of the household. Despite his resistance, there were small signs that he was coming to terms with the situation. He started pitching in more around the house, fixing things instead of letting them break, and even looking into part-time work to help with the bills. It wasn't an acknowledgement of my role, but it was something. One evening, my mom texted me to share a small breakthrough. She mentioned that my dad had admitted, grudgingly, that the structured help I was offering was better than the enabling behavior they'd expected from me. She said he didn't use the word respect, but the sentiment was there. It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever gotten from him, and while it wasn't much, it felt like progress. As the weeks went on, the resentment from my parents began to morph into something closer to grudging respect. They saw that I wasn't enabling them but helping them build a foundation for stability. My sibling, now enrolled in school and working part-time, became a symbol of what was possible when boundaries and support worked together. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time in years, it felt like my family was moving forward, not because of me, but because they were finally taking responsibility for themselves. Update 4. Over the next few months, the changes within my family started to take shape, though not without challenges. My younger sibling re-enrolled in community college, and I covered their first semester's tuition. It wasn't just a financial investment, it was a chance for them to prove to themselves and everyone else that they could take control of their life. Along with school, they started working part-time at a local cafe. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a step toward independence. My siblings' growth was evident almost immediately. They started managing their schedule better, showing up to work on time, and even studying at the library between shifts. Occasionally, they'd send me updates about their grades or stories about their job. I could tell they were proud of themselves, and honestly, I was proud too. Meanwhile, my parents began adjusting to their new reality. My mom, encouraged by the budgeting advice I'd given her, started tracking expenses and finding ways to cut costs. She sold off some old furniture and appliances they didn't use anymore, and even downsized a portion of her business. It wasn't enough to completely stabilize their finances, but it was a start. She also became more open about her appreciation for my help, often texting me to share updates on their progress. My dad, however, was a different story. He resisted any form of guidance, especially from me. Anytime my mom mentioned the budgeting spreadsheet I'd helped her set up, he'd leave the room or change the subject. It was clear he still hadn't come to terms with the shift in our dynamic. He avoided direct interaction with me as much as possible, which honestly I was fine with. Despite the tension with my dad, I decided to host a small family dinner at my house. It had been over a year since I'd had everyone together, and I figured it might help rebuild some semblance of normalcy. My sibling was enthusiastic, offering to bring dessert from their cafe. My mom seemed genuinely excited too, though she warned me not to expect too much from my dad. The dinner started off okay. My sibling and I caught up, and my mom marveled at how I decorated my place. My dad sat quietly, picking at his food and occasionally chiming in with surface-level comments. The atmosphere was tense but manageable, until my dad decided to break the silence. He made a snide remark about how the family would have been fine without my involvement. The room fell silent. My sibling, who had been biting their tongue all night, finally snapped. They defended me, pointing out how much I'd helped and how their own progress wouldn't have been possible without my support. They called out my dad's pride, saying it was the very thing that had held the family back for so long. The argument escalated quickly. My dad accused my sibling of being ungrateful and turning against him. My mom tried to mediate, but the damage was done. My dad stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. My mom apologized profusely, clearly embarrassed, and said she was starting to see things differently. She admitted my dad's behavior had been hard to deal with and thanked me for sticking around despite everything. After they left, I sat with my sibling, who looked both frustrated and relieved. They apologized for the outburst but said they couldn't stay silent anymore. I told them I understood and reminded them how far they'd come since the fallout. From that point on, I decided to focus my energy on my sibling and my mom. They were the ones showing growth, and I wasn't going to waste my time trying to change my dad. My sibling continued to thrive in school and even got a small promotion at the cafe. They started making plans to eventually move out and live on their own, which felt like a huge milestone. My mom, too, began showing signs of real progress. She asked for advice on how to market her downsized business better and even started learning basic financial literacy through online tutorials I'd recommended. She became more self-reliant and less defensive about her mistakes, which was a big shift from the person who'd once refused to admit she needed help. My dad, predictably, remained distant. He rarely spoke to me directly and continued to make passive-aggressive comments whenever my name came up. But as much as his behavior frustrated me, I refused to let it derail the progress the rest of us were making. My mom and sibling were proving that change was possible, and that was enough to keep me going. As the family's financial stability slowly improved, the bitterness between us began to fade, at least on the surface. My sibling was flourishing, my mom was learning to stand on her own 2 feet, and I felt like I was finally seeing the light at the end of a very long tunnel. While my relationship with my dad remained strained, I knew I couldn't force him to change. For now, I was content focusing on the parts of my family that were willing to meet me halfway. Update 5. Over the next few months, things began to settle into a new normal. My younger sibling finished their first semester back in community college with top grades, which was a huge accomplishment given how much they doubted themselves at the start. Their confidence was clearly growing, and to top it off, they landed a better-paying job at a local bakery. It was still part-time, but it paid more than the cafe and offered more consistent hours. When the next semester rolled around, I covered their tuition again, but I made it clear this would be the last time. I reminded them that this was about building independence, not creating another cycle of dependency. They seemed to understand, and I could tell they were already thinking about how to plan for the future. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation had stabilized. My mom stuck to the budget we'd created, and even managed to save enough to start a smaller, more manageable version of her previous business. This time, she asked for my advice on how to promote it online, which felt like progress. She started posting regularly on social media, offering discounts and connecting with local customers. Her efforts paid off, and she started seeing steady income again. My dad, however, remained distant. He still avoided direct interaction with me whenever possible. If my mom mentioned my name or anything I'd done to help, he would find an excuse to leave the room or change the topic. His bitterness was palpable, but I wasn't going to let it ruin the progress the rest of us were making. My siblings' personal growth became the highlight of this period. They began talking about moving out and living on their own, a step they'd never seriously considered before. One evening, they announced their plans to start looking for an apartment. The reaction at home was explosive. My dad accused me of encouraging them to abandon the family and claimed I was breaking the family apart by pushing them toward independence. My mom tried to calm him down, but it was clear he saw this as another challenge to his authority. My sibling, however, stood their ground. They told him this was something they'd wanted for a long time, and that it wasn't about abandoning the family, it was about doing what was best for themselves. They even pointed out how much my help had contributed to their success, which only seemed to frustrate my dad further. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with my sibling to help them navigate the process of finding a place. We looked at rental listings, talked about budgeting for rent and utilities, and even visited a few apartments together. Eventually, they found a small but cozy one-bedroom place not far from their school and job. I helped them with the lease paperwork and covered the initial deposit as a final gesture of support. Moving day was bittersweet. My mom was supportive but emotional, hugging my sibling tightly as we loaded up the car. My dad, predictably, refused to participate. He stayed inside the house, not even acknowledging the moment. My sibling didn't seem surprised but admitted it stung a little. Still, they were determined not to let it overshadow the milestone. Once my sibling was settled into their new place, I started scaling back the financial help I'd been providing to my parents. Their budget was stable, and with my mom's business bringing in consistent income, they didn't need my support as much anymore. I told my mom this directly, and she took it surprisingly well. She thanked me for everything I'd done and admitted she'd learned a lot over the past year. She even apologized for how things had been handled in the past, saying she now understood why I'd made the choices I had. As for my dad, our relationship remained strained. I considered cutting ties with him completely more than once, but I decided against it for my mom's sake. She was making real progress, and I didn't want to jeopardize that by creating more tension. For now, I kept our interactions civil but distant, focusing on the parts of my family that were willing to meet me halfway. Looking back, the journey had been anything but easy. There were moments when I questioned whether stepping back into their lives was the right choice, especially with all the emotional baggage it brought. But seeing my sibling thrive and my mom become more self-reliant made it worth it. I didn't regret helping them, but I was firm in my decision to maintain boundaries moving forward. My sibling moving out marked a turning point for our family. It was proof that change was possible, even in a dynamic as complicated as ours. While my dad remained a source of tension, I felt hopeful for the first time in a long time. I knew things would never be perfect, but for now I was content with the progress we'd made and the independence we'd all gained along the way.